Okay, welcome back on this second day of the GroundWork Dialogue Symposium. Today we are we are looking at healing and repairing, and we had a wonderful morning, very stimulating, and a performance in the noon. And now we welcome Matthew and Reuben. So let me introduce you to this duo who are based in, they are joining us from Vancouver in Canada. Matthew is a co-editor of Capacious, a journal for emerging affect inquiry, and a member of the Radical Open Access Collective. He organizes the international conference Affect Inquiry and Making Space. He teaches at HUM, an interdisciplinary program with residents of Vancouver's downtown Eastside at the University of British Columbia, and facilitates an ongoing 14-week feminist techno-science salon. His work reads across feminist and Indigenous techno-science to imagine accountable theory making and new media storytelling practices. And he will be presenting with Reuben. Reuben's work is guided by methods set out in settler-colonial studies, as well as critical feminist race and queer theories. He says, learning from place might be construed as a practice of respect, a concept that continually emerges in my studies, in my work, and in my activism. A theory of respect might serve as a geographical analysis attuned to the poetics and politics of un-ceded land and foster relations between native and non-native peoples. They will be sharing with us some thoughts about their work, Composting Futures. So it's over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marina. And thank you to Marina and Veronica for organizing the symposium. We haven't been able to catch much because, of course, the time difference. We're just 7 a.m. here today. But we'll present for about 20 minutes, a series of provocations around work we've done critically and creatively with compost. And so I'm just going to jump right in. I'll just share my screen here. Okay. So our provocation today offers compost, putting food and garden scraps in a heap where they might be reworked into good soil, as a method for dreaming up multi-species futures, for making kin, healing and repairing, and learning how to live together amidst ruin, to touch on just a few of the symposium themes. As a field of study in feminist theory, compost is described by Donna Haraway, Astrida Neimanis, Jennifer May Hamilton, and in our own work, as empirical, figural, and speculative. Academic works that engage compost are grounded in feminist science and technology studies and do work on the political, ecological, technological, racialized and gendered vectors through which the terms nature and culture are enacted as discontinuous. This includes critical attention to labor, reproduction, and care, questions of non-human agency and human subjectivity, notions of accountability and situatedness, modes of attention or attuning, and the politics, ethics, and possibilities of living with and caring for human and non-human others. As a field, compost demonstrates how spending time in messy modalities can help us to see our implicatedness and responsibility in non-human worlds. There are risks to cohering compost into a field of study. Knowledge projects that seek to expand circles of care and responsibility can get mired in academic conventions in terms of citation, writing style, publishability, and so on. Civic composting projects and waste management regimes, for example, can become industrialized and work as an alibi for increased extraction, consumption, and waste. Theorizing doesn't happen in a vacuum. To think with compost is to interrogate the coloniality of agricultures and their practices, and to locate compost in industrializing and extractive nation-building projects, and in the plantationocene, Haraway's term for racialized agricultures of scale. Compost isn't local, and it isn't innocent. The food scraps that end up on the compost heap are implicated in global supply chains, genetic modification, ideas of the organic, or appetites and diet fads. This is a significant commonality we share across continents. So much food is grown by precarious racialized migrant workers.
Before we gave much thought to compost, we did it in a garden called un-ceded at the University of British Columbia's farm. The name was given to the garden in 2014 and means the place where we grow in the Hunkaminam language of the Musqueam people. Along with the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations, Musqueam is one of 3 Indigenous groups whose lands were stolen in the founding of the coastal port city of Vancouver, where we live. The garden, also known as the Indigenous Health Research and Education Garden, is a place where medicinal plants, both native and non-native to the Northwest Pacific coast, grow together. Such species mixing troubles garden visitors' expectations of what they'll find growing in a quote-unquote native plant garden. Eucalyptus and lavender grow alongside tobacco, yarrow, wild roses, mints, and other species such as dandelion, often deemed as weeds. In un-ceded, the ethos is that the plants themselves are the teachers, so questions of origin are less relevant than notions of being in good relation. Work in the garden is done with respect, undertaken with notions of reciprocity between plants and humans and a sense of mutual responsibility. So contrast this with the English-style rose garden at the other end of the university campus, shaped by stern hedges. Its rosarium form is achieved only by what has been made absent, clipped away, including places of ongoing significance to Musqueam. Natasha Myers defines gardens as, quote, sites where people stage their relationships with plants, end quote. So gardens are shot through with aesthetic, cultural, and political expectations. They entwine botanical, horticultural, and geopolitical histories. They are hedged in by municipal bylaws and disagreements between neighbors. They can be markers of class or of ecological values. And they are made use of by a whole host of critters. As Jamaica Kincaid notes, the shape of a garden isn't separate from its histories of imperialism and colonization. To keep a garden in shape, trimmings must go somewhere, and compost is implicated in these histories. Vancouver is a city of stark juxtapositions. It's hyper-wealthy, but also is the epicenter of Canada's affordability, homelessness, and opioid crises. Vancouver's railway and transportation corridors were built by forced Chinese laborers and intern Japanese workers, even while racist state policies banned migrants from most of Asia up until the late 1960s. The city's wealth is drawn out of the land through extractive industries like forestry, fishing, and mining, and this accumulation of wealth follows a 500-year-long history of imperial exploitation. Having laid waste to their own lands, European nations set sail in search of new resources and routes by which to exchange them. To think critically with compost also requires thinking about waste management operations that allow for our world to be configured for capitalist life. In Vancouver, compost piles are everywhere, and at the civic level, industrial scale composting is just one of a whole repertoire of ways in which Vancouver greenwashes its image.
The composition of compost, what scraps it is made up of, is not separate from how the world has been composed. The various practices that surround compost demonstrate different understandings of sovereignty, how political subjects are constituted, who or what counts as a subject or agent, who holds and exercises power, who or what has agency, can act, make meaning. Here in Vancouver, civic, academic, and arts events always begin with an acknowledgement. We are gathered here today on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And yet, Indigenous conceptions of sovereign territory are radically incompatible with the liberal democratic nation state and its policed borders and extractive trade practices. This is a screenshot from the crowdsourced website nativeland.ca, and it shows in a small way the extent of historical territorial overlap. No borders, no ownership, instead a mode of governance based on intergenerational care for lands and waters. And so, unlike definitions of sovereignty in political philosophy or international relations, sovereignty in Indigenous practice is the ongoing act of maintaining ecological balance as a form of governance. And I want to read two quotes from Indigenous studies scholars that drive home this point. Indigenous political theorist Jeff Corntassel writes, quote, "The framing of rights as political and or legal entitlements has de-emphasized the cultural responsibilities and relationships that Indigenous peoples have with their families and the natural world that are critical for their well-being. In contrast with the dominant Western perspective on self-determination and sustainability, Indigenous peoples tend to concern themselves with the idea of learning how to give back to creation rather than taking away." And Indigenous literary theorist Daniel Heath Justice writes, quote, "These relationships extend beyond the human to encompass degrees of kinship with other peoples, from the plants and animals to the sun, moon, thunder, and other elemental forces." The central focus of Indigenous nationhood then is on peoplehood, the relational system that keeps the people in balance with one another, with other peoples and realities, and with the world. Nationhood is the political extension of the social rights and responsibilities of peoplehood. In our specific context, living and thinking with compost lends itself to this kind of political sensibility, seeing non-humans as having agency, meaning, and value, even culture, despite scientific efforts to distinguish between intention, cognition, and mere instinctual behavior.
To account for the ways in which composting intersects and implicates much larger political processes beyond the sites and scales of backyard piles, we look to Kim Tallbear's account of the 1997 Red River flood, an account which challenges Western notions of ecological renewal. Tallbear does not describe what the river's flooding has ruined, but rather, quote, "the devastation to the earth wrought by white people's agriculture," end quote. She describes the destruction as a site of biocultural hope, where now abandoned monoculture plots have reverted to wetlands and are home again to diverse plant and animal life. The wetlands that emerge from such ruin recall the regenerative capacity of compost, caught up in varying states of decay. Tallbear helps us to understand that being together in compost is not always romantic. This past fall, we were witness to the devastation that flooding can bring. In November, an atmospheric river swept across Vancouver and the surrounding areas. The storm washed out bridges and highways, cutting off Vancouver from the rest of the country, and brought the port to a standstill. It inundated the Sumas Prairie, forcing the evacuation of 17,000 people and killing 1.3 million farm animals. The prairie was once a shallow lake. Nearly a century ago, it was drained by settlers in an effort to remove Indigenous communities, making farmland out of an area once populated with salmon, freshwater mussels, deer, and humans, all living in close relationship to the rise and fall of the waters. As Toni Morrison writes, quote, "In fact, it is not flooding, it is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was," end quote. This is a risky sentiment, and theorizing compost forces us to think forwards and backwards, imagining what a landscape once looked like and what it might look like in the future. Climate events like flooding provoke us to think ethically about what kinds of technological fixes we seek. Bigger roads, bigger dikes, bigger dams. Thinking alongside compost What would it mean to proactively return areas to wetlands or floodplains? To build for renewal as if we too remembered where water used to be? The flooding is a disaster, certainly, but so too was the draining of the lake. 1,000 kilometers north from here, the Wet'suwet'en Nation is engaged in a years-long standoff with the Canadian government over a pipeline proposed to run through their ancestral lands. By Canada's own laws, the pipeline is an illegal imposition on Wet'suwet'en territory. And despite years of professed commitment to state and Indigenous reconciliation, the government has, for the third time now, sent in a heavily armed police force to remove Indigenous peoples from their own lands and to facilitate the interests of a corporate oil and gas project. Whether it is the draining of a lake or the forced laying of pipelines, Canada exerts its nationhood by laying waste to the territories of Indigenous nations, risking their millennia-old relations with plants, animals, waters, and other elemental forces. Where compost belongs both to environmental humanities that ascribe agency to compost critters and as a part of waste and ecosystem management practices caught up in nation building, its stakes are so much more than just sustainability. Composting in this place means accounting for the non-humans of compost as possible subjects of an Indigenous political system that would see them as peoples with their own distinct needs, cultures, and lifeways, not simply as the backdrop of human desires.
In closing, we want to offer up one framing of a compost future. The 3D printed earthen form shown on this slide is deceptive. Designed by architect Mario Cucinella and WASP, Italy's leading 3D printing company, the process called TECLA, for technology and clay, is described as radically sustainable, requiring no transportation of materials to the site. But its organicism and claim to zero waste is made possible only by access to costly computing infrastructure and the shipment of large-scale machinery. It shows how architecture, even romantically inflected as of the earth, is largely techno-scientific, relying on understandings of material and cultural realities that are mediated by technology and by the claims of mainstream sciences. Knowing this, it's crucial to intervene in conversations about sustainability and justice with attention to how our taken for granted truths about materials, about ways of life or standards of living, and about natural processes and phenomena are historically situated, contoured by political agendas, and made durable or maintained by networks of practice. These mud huts are made by Indigenous peoples in West Central Africa. The Musqueam peoples live on the floodplains straddling the border between northern Cameroon and Chad. And their architecture accordingly is built to anticipate flooding, then to be patched up again with what is at hand. Unlike the Tekla house, no computing infrastructure or machinery is required. Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe writes, quote, "In the global south, energy-intensive extraction, agricultural expansion, predatory sales of land, and destruction of forests will continue unabated. The power and the cooling of computer chips and supercomputers depends on it." End quote. Techno-scientifically mediated design is about so much more than use and form. It is about what is being included and what is being othered. Even the purity of an idea like the local is not immune. Our waste is exported to poorer nations. Our cities are gentrified, people are displaced. Waters and landscapes are ravaged in the rush to build with wood, steel, concrete, and glass. Haraway writes, quote, "I worry about the oppositional quality of nature and design as if they are two different things. Nature for Westerners and people who have been influenced by Western histories tends to mean that which is separable from human activity. You might add in a few Indigenous people, but only insofar as they are more natural than you. In short, a colonialist move. Meanwhile, the real people, the designers, the scientists, are left as not natural. After all, it was the classificatory impetus to equate Indigenous peoples with the natural that allowed European colonial projects to see land as terra nullius, or empty lands. It was the devaluing and hierarchicalizing of plant and animal life as mere materials for human use, alongside the animalization of enslaved Black peoples, that fueled colonial expansion. I wonder how thinking with compost and its soil and critters might hold these histories in view. I give these examples because I think it's a practitioner's task to think beyond Western analytics, to ask who designs, what technologies count, and expanding who to include not only those whom the West has historically othered, but also to plants, animals, and elements.
In their everyday life, felling trees, eating plants, and building dams, beavers, like compost, create the conditions for multi-species flourishing. Dams slow water's hurried flow. They raise stream levels and flood adjacent plains, restoring the water table and making forests and prairies less vulnerable to fires. Later this year, beaver dams will also be on display as part of a rewilding exhibit at the famed Chelsea Flower Show. Beaver Lake in Vancouver's Stanley Park has been dredged by city workers many times over the last century. Keeping Beaver Lake as a lake takes work. Today, the Parks Board is re-engineering the lake to act as an avian and aquatic animal habitat. But despite residents in their namesake lake, the beavers are being targeted by park staff as culprits in the lake's decline. It's their dam that prevents debris from flowing downriver. Workers have now removed the dam and installed instead a metal outlet to regulate water levels. While good for fish and birds, the structure prevents future dams from being built. Later on, the lake will be dredged to enhance deep water areas for fish, and islands will be built as nesting sites for birds. And all of this sounds good, but it entails an understanding of naturalness that excludes beavers. So what if we paid attention to them instead? As Cleo Wolfe Erskine and July Cole write, when beavers are reintroduced or allowed to roam, they make novel ecosystems. They incorporate industrial odds and ends like road culverts and trash, quote, tying river systems and species back together in ways that increase resilience in the face of colonial devastation, end quote. So the landscapes that emerge in the wake of catastrophe aren't pure. They might well be poisoned. Following the flooding here, officials pleaded that we not enter the water. It was full of chemicals, pollutants, the carcasses of trapped farm animals, and compost. Beaver dams, likewise, are not picturesque visions of nature. They flood out roads or walking paths. They render a once beautiful lake no longer recognizable. Like floods or beaver dams, composting isn't a practice that will return us to some Edenic garden. Its situation as an agricultural practice prohibits such wishful thinking. All that compost offers is a mode of attuning to the liveliness of the non-human world around us, those critters and elements with whom we are co-constituted and upon whom we so deeply depend. Compost, from the Latin composita, meaning to put together. And this is compost's humble offering, putting us together in the mix with non-human others, all of us caught up in the processes of living and dying. I'm giving the final word to Indigenous poet Erica Violet Lee, in whose wasteland theory we read a way of attending to the mounting ecological devastations brought against the land and akin to what we hope compost theory might offer. Quote, wastelands are spaces deemed unworthy of healing because of the scale and amount of devastation that has occurred there. Wastelands are named wastelands by the ones responsible for their devastation. And once they have devastated the earth, logged the forest bare, poisoned the water, turned our neighborhoods into brown fields so that we must grow our vegetables in pots above the ground, once they have consumed all that they believe to be valuable, the rest is discarded. But the heart of wastelands theory is simple. Here we understand that there is nothing and no one beyond healing. So we return again and again to the discards gathering scraps for our bundles, and we tend to the devastation with destabilizing gentleness, carefulness, and softness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reuben and Matt, for this absolutely wonderful presentation. We have already questions and suggestions from the people online. What can we say about this idea of composting as getting together and putting together things, but getting together, and what you mentioned, the ecological balance as a way of governance. So we have lots to learn from Indigenous knowledges.